Right, good morning. I'm David Truman and I'm joined by my colleague Kiki Moss, and we're here to talk about the demystification of trust. Thank you for joining us. We aim to last about 45 minutes. I apologise in advance if I overrun. If you've got any questions as we go along, if you put those in the chat, it may well be that we then come back to you afterwards with an answer. We will be recording this and sharing the recording later. So the plan for today is essentially to talk about trust. I've worked in trusts throughout my career. I started off working specifically in trusts in the late 80s. At that point, trusts were very popular in inheritance tax planning. Subsequently to that, there have been about 10 changes in the legislation, and trusts have become not as mainstream as they used to be, but they are still a valuable part of inheritance tax planning. So the idea is to talk about the basics of trusts and then to go through some planning examples of where we see them being used. So I'm going to hand over to Kiki, who's going to talk about the basics of trust structures.
Thank you, David. Yes, I'm Kiki. I'm the trust manager at Menzies. Today I'm going to explain what a trust is. I'm going to explain various reasons for setting up a trust, and then I'm going to discuss 4 common types of trust, basic trusts, before going on to discuss the rules, the current rules, but how these rules have changed and how they've affected the setup of trusts. So first of all, what is a trust? A trust is a structure that can hold an asset, future generations, and I like to think of it as a fruit tree. The settler will be the individual that plants or sows that seed into the ground, puts the asset into that trust. It's the trustees that oversee the trust, like gardeners. They maintain it and look after that tree to ensure it grows to its full capacity. And then the beneficiaries will be the individuals that can benefit from that tree, can pick the fruit, can have the income of that tree. There are various reasons for setting up a trust, and here you go, I've listed some here. They allow ultimate flexibility. So the first one is protect family wealth. That's about asset protection. By putting an asset into a trust rather than giving it to an individual outright, it cases it, it looks after it for them for future changes to their circumstances. So for example, if it's in trust and that individual, that beneficiary, unfortunately goes through divorce hearing later in life, at least that asset being in trust doesn't form part of their assets when it comes to that divorce hearing. It's much better protected. It's to support those who can't manage their own money. These can be vulnerable beneficiaries, they can be minors, they can be people with mental disabilities that can't look after their own financial affairs. So by putting it in trust, you at least know there's trustees helping them oversee those financial affairs going forward. There's some rules and regulations to help look after them. It's for your own inheritance tax planning. So if you're an individual that has more assets than you currently need, it's about looking ahead, gifting them away now while you can, and reducing your own estate before you die. And so the tax man is getting all that inheritance tax, passing it to future generations now, early enough. It's about maintaining control. So even though you've died, you've gone, you've still got some control about what happens to those assets. You've worked really hard in your lifetime for that income, for those assets, and you want to know that they're going to be looked after. And whereas if you was to give them outright to an individual, they might be blown straight away. So it's keeping that control. And David will give a good example later on about that control in one of his examples. And as I said, it's ultimate flexibility. So now I'm just going to discuss 4 common types of trust. And the first one I'm going to discuss is about bare trusts. A bare trust is where assets are held directly for the beneficiary. So although it's in trust under the trustee's name, the beneficiaries own those assets outright, and the income is taxed on those beneficiaries. On the whole, bare trusts are typically for minor individuals, minor beneficiaries under the age of 18, although you would need to watch the parental rules here. So as long as that asset wasn't gifted into trust by a parent, so it could be a grandparent but they're gifted in by someone other than the parent, then all that income generated from that asset will be taxed on the beneficiary, and the beneficiary has absolute right to it. The benefits of a bare trust, therefore, if they are for a minor, will be that on the whole, that minor won't have other forms of income. They won't have a big tax liability that an adult might have with other sources of income, and therefore they can be advantageous to them because they'll be taxed on it with their full personal allowance. And the other point to mention, that gifting into a bare trust, gifting that asset into a bare trust, is treated like a potentially exempt transfer. So when you gift that asset, when you outlive it 7 years, then it will fall out of your estate. You won't be charged inheritance tax on that gift. It's no longer in your estate. The next type of trust I'm going to discuss is life interest trust. These are trusts where the beneficiary has an absolute entitlement to the income of that trust. They can sometimes be entitled to capital. It would depend on the terms of the trust, but they are entitled to the income. So that fruit tree I mentioned, they're entitled to all that fruit, all the income generated by that trust. Life interest trusts are taxed at the lower rates. So dividends are taxed at 7.5%, interest is taxed at 20%, and the income is then, you'd get an R185, you'd put that onto a beneficiary's personal tax return, but they've got the tax credit that the trust has suffered. Prior to 2006, these trusts, when you gifted them, they were potentially exempt transfers. You gifted that asset, you set up a life interest trust for a beneficiary. They fell out of your estate. Assuming you lived 7 years, they fell out of your estate. However, that's not necessarily the case now. Rules have changed, which I'll discuss in a little bit. But previously, they all fell out of your estate. So people did often set up life interest trusts. And the good thing about life interest trusts is that they formed that beneficiary's estate. When they come to die, then they would form their estate and they'd be taxed on death. They wouldn't be taxed during the lifetime of the trust. There are some examples where the rules haven't affected this, and IPD trusts and vulnerable beneficiary trusts, which I'll come on to, and David will also give you some good examples. But on the whole, the thing to remember for life interest trusts is that all the income is entitled to the beneficiary. A third type of trust is discretionary trust. These are trusts where they allow ultimate flexibility for the trustees. Trustee chooses how and when capital and income is pointed out to a beneficiary. They decide how often, and they can base it on circumstances. So that beneficiary might need income or capital at one point, but not necessarily another point, or vice versa. That individual might be coming to buy a property. So now's the right time to give that beneficiary a distribution. The income is taxed at the higher rates, though, unlike a life interest trust, which I just explained. The income is taxed higher, so anything after the first £1,000 and dividends after that are taxed at the higher rates of 38.1%, and interest is taxed at 45%. It does mean, though, that a beneficiary who's given the distribution will have a larger tax credit, so therefore they can potentially claim some of that back. They would have had 45% tax credit, depending on their other sources of income. They can claim some of that back. You do have to watch out for tax pool issues, because any distributions from a trust should really be matched to the taxes paid by the trustees. And if you over distribute, you will be penalised a large tax liability. These types of trusts are subject to inheritance tax. So every 10 years, value of these trusts are assessed. Anything over the nil rate band, so if there's one settler, the nil rate band would be 325,000. Anything over that, it will be assessed every 10 years and taxed, be subject to inheritance tax, a maximum rate of 6%. And similarly, if capital is distributed, that will also be taxed, a maximum rate of 6%, although that's prorated for the time it's been in trust. As I say, discretionary trust is the ultimate flexible one. The trustees decide as and when, based on the beneficiary circumstances. The next type of trust is a vulnerable beneficiaries trust. These are set up for a vulnerable person. Now, that could be a beneficiary who's lost a parent under the age of 18. It could be a disabled person. Now, there's a long list of benefits on the government site, long list of benefits. If they're eligible for one of those benefits, they don't necessarily need to be claiming it, but if they're eligible, they could potentially set up a vulnerable person's trust, or a beneficiary who can't look after their own financial affairs because of mental conditions. If it's decided that a beneficiary does qualify as a vulnerable person under these rules, then an election form would need to be submitted to HMRC. And once HMRC have agreed that it can be a vulnerable beneficiaries trust, then there are some good special tax rates. So for income tax purposes, a vulnerable person's trust is taxed at the lower rate, similar to a life interest trust. So dividends again will be taxed at 7.5%, interest at 20%. They get double the capital gains allowance, and so a normal trust would get half what a person gets in a personal allowance. However, these types of trusts will get double. They would get what a person would get for capital gains purposes. And inheritance tax. Again, these trusts, unlike a discretionary trust, they're not taxed every 10 years. The value of them is not looked at. And when they make capital appointments out to the beneficiary, again, they're not taxed inheritance tax. Now I'm just going to explain about the rule changes. So prior to 2006, we used to get a lot of people coming forward wanting to set up various trusts, and they would set up more than one trust, because prior to 2006, any gifts, regardless of the value, so it could be more than 325,000, they were potentially exempt transfers as long as you outlived them 7 years and they fell out of your estate. So you had various people coming forward to set up more than one trust, one for a wife, one for grandchildren. You'd get A&M settlements where they wanted their grandchildren to have trust between the ages of 18 and 25, where they'd look after their school fees during the early years, and then they could get their hands on the capital. We had numerous people coming forward, and as I said before, life interest trusts, they weren't subject to inheritance tax either. They form part of that beneficiary's estate when they come to die. So we did have a lot of people coming forward to create trust prior to the rule changes. But then now I'm just going to explain the rule changes. On 22nd of March 2006, rules did change quite drastically, and pretty much any new trust created since that point are now relevant property trusts, subject to a lot more inheritance tax. So unlike previously when they could be potentially exempt transfers, that's not the case now. If you gift anything, any asset over your nil rate band of 325,000, you're taxed straight away. It's a chargeable lifetime transfer. You're taxed at 20% as and when you gift that amount away. Then you're also the trust where the asset has gone into, that's assessed every 10 years after that in a relevant property trust, and anything over that nil rate band again is taxed maximum rate of 6% to inheritance tax. And likewise, when capital is distributed out to people, to beneficiaries, again a maximum rate of 6%, but it will be subject to inheritance tax, prorated. Now there are some exceptions to this, like qualifying interest in possession trusts for one, and vulnerable beneficiary trusts that I've mentioned. But on the whole, most trusts since 2006 have now been subject to a lot more inheritance tax on the way in, during the life of the trust, and every time a capital distribution is made. But despite these rule changes, with a lot of planning and speaking to the right people, you can still set up the correct trusts with the best planning. So I'm going to pass over to David now, who's going to give you some good examples of where planning does work. Thank you.
Thank you, Kiki. Right, so as Kiki said, and I said at the start, we've historically used trust in inheritance tax planning, and I'm going to run through examples where each one of the trusts that Kiki has mentioned, how they are continue to be used in our inheritance tax planning. So the idea of these circumstances is we get involved in inheritance tax planning with a family. It's a process we go through. We work out what the aspirations of the family are, what their income requirements are, what their current income is, what their current assets are. And where trusts are generally used, as Kiki said, are where you've got to the point in your life where you've built up your asset base and you are considering gifting assets to your children, to your grandchildren, but perhaps you are concerned about wanting to retain control over those assets. The changes in 2006 were generated by the thought at the time that the government and HMRC considered that trusts were only really for tax avoidance. Trusts were used a lot when there were tax schemes for the avoidance of tax. It was quite often that trusts were used for those purposes. And more recently, perhaps they've been used in circumstances where asset protection had an overriding concern for the family, either where you had vulnerable beneficiaries or really where you were very concerned about your descendants sort of squandering the wealth that you've created. But as we said, there are still lots of opportunities available. So the first one is the use of BPR Trusts. As Kiki said, these are basically the simplest form of trusts. Where we see these used, in the very simplest circumstance, it's where you have, say, a grandparent who wants to set up a bank account for their grandchild. A little bit, this is easier said than done. This used to be very simple. It's now a little bit more complicated, but you would go along to the bank with the child's birth certificate and you would set up a bank account, and essentially that bank account will be held in a BPR trust. So whilst the money was there for the benefit of the grandchild, it would be controlled by either the grandparent or the parent. It's also seen where perhaps, so where the grandparent has perhaps built up wealth, they've got new grandchildren, they're wanting the best for their grandchildren. We often see that perhaps the grandparents are offering to provide school fees for private education for their grandchildren. Perhaps the parents don't have the resources to be able to fund that, and the grandparents do. So it's quite common that, and this is in the past where you would have seen the accumulation and maintenance trusts. The slight concern with the changes with BPR Trusts was because the beneficiary acquires the assets personally at the age of 18, but obviously where these are used for school planning, the idea is that the grandparents at the start would set up a trust containing the funds that they sort of anticipated would be required for the school fees over the period of their education. So the intention would be that by the time they got to 18, all of those funds would have been spent. It's also a way we see if you've got a family company, so you've built up the family business, maybe you've got the grandparents, the parents involved. One way to spread the ownership of that business is to transfer small amounts of shares into the names of the grandchildren. Obviously, grandchildren, minors in general can't own assets under the age of 18 in their own name. So it is possible to have some sort of simplistic arrangement. BPR Trusts are very simple. Effectively, all you're saying is you're transferring the assets from the grandparent to be held by somebody as trustees. That could be the grandparents, could be the parents, for the benefit of the grandchildren. There's nothing particularly more complicated than that. And as long as the assets come from the grandparent, the grandchild is taxed on all the income and the capital gains of that. Immediate post-death interest trusts. These were effectively one form of interest in possession settlement, which was retained after the changes in 2006. Now, what this is essentially only applied set up in a will. Now, the basic position between a sort of married couple is that the assets generally would go on the death of the first spouse, they would go to the second spouse, and then on the death of the second spouse, they would go to the children. What I would always say to people, and I'll follow up with some examples, is that you should always consider putting the assets on the first death into a immediate post-death interest trust. What that means is that you retain the control over the circumstances for the benefit of your children in the event that your spouse was to remarry or have a change in circumstances. So in these circumstances, the spouse would have an interest in possession, so they'd be entitled to their income during the remainder of their life. They would be able to ask for capital distributions from the trust. The trust is in their estate for inheritance tax purposes, so it doesn't change the inheritance tax position. But the main purpose of the deed is to provide asset protection. So by way of example, we have a married couple, Eric. Eric works in the city. He has a wife, Nellie, and they have 2 children and 4 grandchildren. Eric has a nice house in Edgware. He has some cash in bank accounts. He has a nice pension from his built up during his working life. Unfortunately, Nellie dies, leaving Eric alone, and Eric meets Ella. Ella is a very nice lady who looks after Eric in his old age, but unfortunately, or not unfortunately, Ella has a child herself. Then unfortunately, Eric dies. Now, Eric's will said he leaves the assets to Ella, and that was all it said. So he basically left all his assets, which is not uncommon, outright to Ella. Then unfortunately, Ella died, and all of Ella's estate, including Eric's former estate, went to Ella's daughter. And Eric's descendants, his children and grandchildren, didn't benefit from his estate in any way. So that's an example of how sort of death and remarriage can cause unwanted outcomes. The second example is Albert. Albert is married to Joyce. Albert is an electrician. Albert has 3 children and 7 grandchildren. Albert has a house in Luton. He has appears to have some savings, and he has a pension. Unfortunately, Joyce then dies. Albert was booked on a cruise, and Albert went on the cruise. Whilst he was on the cruise, he met June, and subsequently married June. Unfortunately, subsequently, Albert had a stroke, and June, as a consequence of that, found out that Albert had already undertaken some planning. The house that Albert appeared to live in, he cohabited with his daughter, and therefore had gifted the property to his daughter, and therefore it was outside of his estate. He didn't really have the pile of cash that she thought he had, and was effectively living off his state pension. So what this demonstrates is, because in these circumstances, otherwise June would have had a claim on his estate, but because he'd done the pre-planning, she didn't have any claim. The good news is that Albert is still alive. He's 102, and both Albert and Eric are my wife's grandfathers, which is why it's sort of close to our heart. These sort of things can get very emotive within families, so we would always recommend the immediate post-death interest trust to provide that control after your death. Sorry, I should move the slides on. So business property relief trusts, as Kiki said, where you're using discretionary trusts, or in fact most trusts these days, you have an inheritance tax charge on the entry and throughout the lifetime of the trust. There are circumstances where this doesn't apply, and one of these is where you've got business property relief. So business property relief is really designed so that if you've spent your lifetime building up the value in your business, it doesn't disappear in inheritance tax on your death. It allows you to pass the assets to other people without an inheritance tax charge. So this is a common scenario that we see. We've got Harry and Fiona, husband and wife, shares in a family trading company. They've spent their life building up their family trading company. In this case, they both own 40% of the shares in the company. They'd previously transferred 10% of the shares to their children, who were also involved in the business. They each have a will, leave the assets in an IPD for their spouse, and then on to their children. The company qualifies for business property relief. The company is very successful. It's generating lots of cash in the business. Harry and Fiona have already earned plenty of money during their lifetime. They have enough money to live off already, due to extracting the value out of the company over their lifetime. So they don't really need the dividends. And they've got grandchildren pending. So this is a common scenario that we see. And there are useful uses of trusts in these type of scenarios. So what we would do here, this slide does look a little complicated. So obviously we've got the trading company owned by H and F, 40% each, and their children. What they can do is they can establish a discretionary trust, and they can transfer some of the ownership of their own shares into a discretionary trust. There is a consideration here, depending upon exactly how they want to be structured. They may consider setting up a new class of shares to allow them to pay dividends separately to the trust, but that would need careful planning. Now, the transfer of shares into the trust, firstly, doesn't have an inheritance tax charge because the shares are 100% covered by business property relief. And secondly, because they are business assets, they also qualify for something called holdover relief. So there's no capital gains tax on the disposal into the trust. So effectively, you can get the shares of the trading company into the trust without any charge to tax. Then, having set the trust up, H and F can still be the trustees of that trust. J and S can obviously also be involved in that. And the trust can be set up for the benefit of grandchildren. So the circumstances here is that without the trust, what you might find is you may find the grandparents, as I've said, might be wanting to pay school fees or nursery fees or whatever it is for the benefit of their grandchildren. And in normal circumstances, they would be paying that out of their taxed income. So they receive a salary, they pay tax on that salary, and they use the net income to pay the school fees. In this circumstance, the dividend can be paid directly from the trading company to the discretionary trust. The discretionary trust would then pay tax on it in the same way as they would individuals. But when the school fees were paid on behalf of the grandchildren, they can actually claim the tax back, and the tax can either go to the grandchildren to spend on whatever they want to spend it on, or it can go back into the trust. So this is a very good way to utilise surplus cash in a company for funding sort of expenses of your family down the line. Secondly, unfortunately, we then get to the death of H. So H dies, as we've said. If H leaves all his assets to Fiona, then there is no inheritance tax because that is an interspousal transfer. Now that applies equally whether he leaves them outright to Fiona or whether he leaves them in immediate post-death interest trust. Assuming he hasn't set up the trust, there would be a transferable nil rate ban. So there'd be some allowances available of up to £1 million of IHT exemption on his death. And then on Fiona's death, the estate comprised in the trading company, the family home, and the investment portfolio would effectively lead to an inheritance tax liability of £940,000. So that's basically H leaves the assets to F, and then F subsequently dies without having done any planning. The inheritance tax is £940,000. However, if on H's death he decides that he will leave all the assets to Fiona on death, apart from the shares in the trading company, which, as we said, she's already got enough wealth, she's already got enough income, she doesn't really need the shares in the trading company, there is no inheritance tax due. But if he leaves the shares to Fiona, effectively he would be wasting the business property relief. So effectively what he can do is he can transfer the shares into a new discretionary trust for the family on his death. That qualifies for business property relief, and the rest of the estate qualifies for the spousal exemption. And Fiona then inherits the rest. What Fiona then can do, which is called double dip relief, is if Fiona can use her personal cash and can buy the company shares back out of the trust. So the trust now has £1 million in cash and Fiona has the shares in the company. Then on Fiona's death, effectively, she's double claimed the business property relief because the business assets are now back in her name. And we've reduced the inheritance tax in the overall estate by £400,000. So that's an example of where if you've got a trading company, you can use it firstly for funding the lifestyle of your family and widening the ownership of the shares in the company. And secondly, you can get inheritance tax benefits by careful planning using trusts. Nil rate band trusts. And now nil rate band trusts have been around for a very long time. As we've said, you get a nil rate band of 325,000. The reason that inheritance tax planning is increasingly required by what we call normal people is because the inheritance tax band has now been frozen, I think, since 2010 at £325,000. Well, whilst there is some relief for your family home with the and also you can transfer the nil rate bands, more and more people are now paying inheritance tax. So in this case, Harry and Fiona have undertaken the IHT planning exercise. They come to the conclusion they have more income and more assets than they're going to need. Relatively modest amount of an estate, but they definitely have more than they're going to need. They have children, their grandchildren. It's very common that you can get to the point where people are prepared to accept that they have more income and more assets than they're ever going to need. But the concern is about actually gifting it to specific individuals and the worry that either they might be divorced, that the beneficiaries might be too young, might not be financially responsible. But they do really accept that, as we've said, any assets that you put into trust or give away more than 7 years before you die fall outside of your estate from inheritance tax. So the sooner you do this planning, the better. So it is possible in the circumstances where you want to give assets away, but you're not really sure who you want to give it to, and you want to retain some control to use a nil rate band trust. Now, effectively, what a nil rate band trust is, each individual gets a nil rate band of 325,000. So as a married couple, that would double to 650,000. As we've said, most transfers into lifetime trusts are chargeable lifetime transfers, but as long as you've got the joint nil rate bands available of 650,000, you can transfer £650,000 into a trust without any inheritance tax, and you avoid the lifetime charge at 20%. It is possible to do this more than once. So once you've got past the 7 years, so if you start doing this sort of planning when you say 50, you can do it again when you're 57, and again when you're 64, and again when you're 71. So you can build up a pot of money within that trust. Okay, there may be tax charges within the trust as it increases in value, but effectively you're providing a pot of money. These can again be used for sort of grandchildren, for school fees, for all those sort of things. The tax advantage is obviously the income isn't taxable on the settlers. So if they've been receiving income that perhaps they didn't need, they've obviously been suffering tax on that. Okay, the trust will still pay the tax, but as we've demonstrated in earlier examples, if the income is paid out to beneficiaries, the tax can be reclaimed back into the trust. So effectively, if you've got, say, minor beneficiaries who've all got their own personal exemptions, it's a way to transfer small amounts of money to a wide group of people without them suffering any tax. And effectively, you're transferring your income to your beneficiaries without suffering a tax charge. So you're effectively getting tax relief on your income. From a capital gains tax perspective, your transfer into the trust. If you transfer assets into the trust, that is a potential capital gains tax charge. But as I mentioned earlier, there is a holdover relief either for business purposes or where you've got a potential inheritance tax charge. So in these circumstances, even though there's a zero rate of tax, you do still have a inheritance tax trigger, and therefore it's you can transfer the assets into the trust, and the trust takes over the original base cost of the settler. There is no CGT charge on the settler as long as the settler doesn't retain a benefit in the trust, and only trustees are therefore taxable on subsequent disposal. Inheritance tax purposes, as we've said, there's no inheritance tax as long as the transfer is within your nil rate band. If you survive 7 years, it falls out of your estate. If you die within that period, there is a certain element of tapering. And as I said, the earlier you start with this sort of planning, the better. One thing we did find when we started doing this planning was that if you took the £325,000 and invested it in an investment portfolio, there was perhaps a disproportionate amount of compliance work involved in doing the tax returns and accounts and things like that go with trusts. One way that can subsequently be avoided is to effectively put the assets into a wrapper. This is particularly the case if you're deferring, if you've got a deferred requirement to make payments from the trust. So if, for instance, you're saying, well, I want to set up a trust to help fund my grandchildren's deposit for a property, that's a common requirement of grandparents. So you've got grandchildren, but they're all very young. You're not going to require any income out of the trust for, say, 10 years or so. Then it is possible to put the assets into a wrapper called an investment bond. And effectively then the income and the gains sit underneath a wrapper, and it's only taxed when you withdraw the funds from the wrapper. So we found that these are very useful with sort of small amounts of money to reduce the compliance costs of dealing with the trust and the sort of administrative burden. And finally, the last example is excluded property trusts. So effectively the circumstance here is we have a circumstance in the UK where we still have something called a non-domiciled tax regime. Essentially, that's where we have a foreign domiciled individual coming to the UK. It's a sort of very political issue at the moment, with the Labour Party saying that they're going to abolish the non-domicile status, but for the time being it still remains. And anyone who is non-domiciled should be considering this potentially prior to a change of government. So the current legislation basically allows a non-domiciled individual to protect their non-UK estate from UK inheritance tax. So it has to be set up by a non-UK domiciled individual. So the circumstances, normally you've got someone coming to the UK for a defined period of time, or relatively defined, but they want to protect their estate from inheritance tax, and they intend to leave at some point in the future. In many circumstances, it might be that you might consider just insuring the liability, which might be cheaper, but for substantial estates, it certainly is worth considering. So the assets must be actually situated outside the UK. It is extended to some UK qualifying collective investments. And it doesn't work for UK residential property. It did used to work for UK residential property. So we're talking about foreign individuals coming to the UK and protecting their estate outside the UK from UK inheritance tax. So basically the advantage is that where the trust retains excluded property status, even if the settler subsequently becomes UK domiciled, they would be protected from inheritance tax. They can't add assets once they become UK deemed domiciled. And so basically this continues forever and is very good protection for the non-domiciled individual. So the case that we have Isabella, who was born in Spain, her domicile of origin in Spain. She's been resident in the UK for 13 out of the last 20 years. So when she gets to 15, she'll be treated as domiciled. And if she was to die, her worldwide estate would become subject to inheritance tax. So therefore, she can consider setting up the excluded property trust before she gets to the 15 years, transferring non-UK assets into it, and that will protect under the current rules forever. Obviously, as I've said, we don't know where these rules are going for now. So I think the key takeaways from this are, so I think we were supposed to have a poll now. So Nikki in the background is going to run a poll, and then we will talk about the key takeaways. So I'll give you a few minutes to consider what you would like to understand more about. Okay, thank you. So, okay, that's interesting results. Okay, so the key takeaways, I think, as we've demonstrated, inheritance tax is increasingly important because, as we said, more and more people who wouldn't historically it was thought that inheritance tax was a tax on the rich. Now, particularly in the southeast, many more families are falling into the scope of inheritance tax. Just on the family home, broadly, it runs. So if your estate is worth more than £2 million, including your house, you will definitely be paying inheritance tax. If you ignore your house, it'll be 650,000, and more people are falling into that. So trusts are sort of coming back into the fore from an inheritance tax perspective. And as we've said, it's ideally in circumstances where you're considering your inheritance tax position and you're concerned about losing some of your estate to inheritance tax. And we can help with sort of talking through the options with regard to that. Broadly, it's based around giving away your assets and effectively dying on the day you run out of cash. But trusts provide the sort of comfort that your sort of legacy will continue and your wishes will continue to be followed. And obviously, if you have existing trusts, it's also important that they should be reviewed to ensure they're actually meeting the original purpose. We commonly find that people set up trusts 20, 30, 50 years ago, and the trusts are still running, but sort of everybody's lost sight of what the real purpose of the trust was. And much as we like doing trust accounts and trust tax returns, we sometimes wonder whether it might be better to wind up the trusts if you're on the sort of third or fourth generation of people who benefited from it. And if the money, particularly if the money has dwindled away, it becomes very disproportionately expensive to run a trust if it's only got a very small amount of money in it. So it's always a good idea to review these things. So that was where the poll was supposed to go. So obviously, as Menzies, we can provide assistance with all of these things. We tend to focus on, we're talking about trusts, but the trusts do tend to come on the back of inheritance tax planning. But we have an established trust team who can help with all of your needs.